Thank you, Jill, and thank you all for coming and leaving Wimbledon. And isn't Roger Federer playing? I feel very honoured that you're here. And at least it didn't clash tonight with the football. I'm going to begin with Byron and his hero, Don Juan. Some of you rather say Don Juan. I'm going to say Don Juan, who, young, naive, and hopeful, is continuing his travels through Europe. He disembarks at Dover, he stops off to see Canterbury Cathedral, and then he journeys on, bound for London, and reaches the top of a high hill, which looks with pride or scorn toward the great city. The high hill? Shooter's Hill. The sun is setting, the view is spectacular. A mighty mass of brick and smoke and shipping, dirty and dusky, but as wide as eye could reach, with here and there a sail just skipping in sight, then lost amidst the forestry of masts. A wilderness of steeples peeping on tiptoe through their sea-coal canopy. A huge dim cupola like a fool's cap crown on a fool's head. And there is London town. Byron then digresses for a bit and leaves his hero standing there gawping before resuming, and we find Don Juan still wrapped in contemplation, lost in wonder of so great a nation. Here, he cried, is freedom's chosen station. Here peals the people's voice. Here are chaste wives, pure lives. Here laws are all inviolate. Every highway's clear. Here, at which point he's interrupted by 4 highwaymen who demand his money or his life. Don Juan has no English, but he knows what's meant when a knife is held to his throat, and he responds by shooting one of the men with a pistol. Perhaps, thought he, it is the country's wont to welcome foreigners in this way. The poem's 2 centuries old, but it still rings a few bells to anyone living in the area. On the one hand, that glorious elevated view, whether from the top of Shooter's Hill or Point Hill or the General Wolfe statue in Greenwich Park. On the other, a sense of apprehension at seeing a vast, unfathomable city. On the one hand, hope, freedom, light, air, expanses of green. On the other, pollution, industry, and oppression. And indeed, difficulties encountered in making your way along the roads of Greenwich without running into some kind of obstruction. On the one hand, security and affluence. On the other, crime and poverty. On the one hand, a feeling that we're living at the heart of things. What could be more the centre of the universe than the meridian line and Greenwich Mean Time? And on the other hand, because it's southeast London, a sense of distance from the centre. Mostly welcome, but sometimes frustrating, as when friends from other parts of London to the north and west make us feel that we're living too far out, so that if they do make the effort to visit, they give the impression that coming through New Cross or driving through the Blackwall Tunnel is not only as long and arduous a trek as going to Birmingham, say, but also dangerous, as though crossing the Thames is as big a deal as crossing the Channel. Well, there's nothing new in this sort of attitude to south of the river. In the 19th century, Peter Ackroyd suggests in his biography of London, the South, quote, remained relatively unknown to other Londoners, except as a source of disquiet, a boundary zone to which London could consign its dirt and rubbish. And Bazalgette proved the point when he located the outflow of his sewage system downriver beyond Woolwich. A poor and disreputable appendage is how Ackroyd puts it. And he quotes a character in H.G. Wells's novel Tono Bungay, travelling in on the railway, who notes how after the villas of Chislehurst, the congestion of houses intensified and piled up, presently into tenements, becoming a boundless world of dingy people. He also quotes a London reporter in 1911 who remarks that to pass over London Bridge is to cross that natural dividing line of peoples. The very streets change in some subtle and unconscious manner, the shops to a more blatant kind, even the people to a different and lower type. It's perhaps because of that same belief that south of the river is a natural home of low, violent types that led Stanley Kubrick to shoot some of his film A Clockwork Orange in Thamesmead, where Alex and his gang of young hoodlums carry out their brutal attacks, rather like the highwayman who mugged Byron's Don Juan. But come on, those of us who live here want to protest. We're not all low, dingy and violent. And look at the rich history of South East London, Greenwich and Blackheath in particular. It was here that Wat Tyler camped, that Henry V was welcomed back from Agincourt, that Henry VIII had his naval dockyards and his deer park, that Sir Walter Raleigh just possibly threw his cloak down so Queen Elizabeth could cross a plashy place without muddying her shoes, that Inigo Jones, Christopher Wren, Hawksmoor, John Soane did some of their finest work. We're proud of the place. We like it here. Certainly I like it here. I have a vivid memory of my first view of Blackheath nearly 4 decades ago. Unlike Don Juan, I approached it not from the south, but from the north, doubly or trebly, you might say, since I grew up in Yorkshire, did my degree in Nottingham, and had spent the previous 6 months in a flat in Tufnell Park. It was a bleak time, the winter of discontent, fuel shortages, power cuts, the 3-day week, and disenchanting for me, a country bumpkin, somehow expecting the capital's streets to be paved with gold. But in a way, I did find gold. I always remember coming up Blackheath Hill for the first time. Some of you may like that feeling, and seeing the open vista, the vast skies, that sense of possibilities opening up. It seemed a good omen. And it was, because my girlfriend and I were coming to see a flat, and the people due to see it ahead of us never turned up. And it was ours for the next 9 months. I was a PhD student then, dividing my time between South East London College, so Technical College, CELTEC, where Alan Griffin, who I hope is here somewhere, was also working. Now it's a block of flats. I was dividing my time between there, the British Museum, the East Greenwich Library, which in those days, I don't know about now, had excellent stock of literary history and criticism, and also books of Blackheath, where a fierce Teutonic lady proprietor would pointedly bustle round you if you browsed for too long. Some of you may remember her. My PhD was in literature, but I had no idea how many literary associations there were with the area. The flat we were in was above a nursery school in Church Terrace off Belmont Hill, and across the road was St. Joseph's Academy, which, unknown to me, David Lodge had attended as a Catholic schoolboy. He came from Brockley, which is renamed Brickley in several of his novels, including Death Sentence, in which the narrator's father comes down, in which the narrator comes down from the Midlands to visit his aging father, whose idea of being taken out to lunch for a treat is to go to the cafe in Sainsbury's at New Cross. Well, I was writing poetry at the time, but I hadn't known any authors as a child, and I didn't expect to know them as an adult, except in books. Real authors, I thought, lived somewhere else, possibly Hampstead. I was wrong. Of course I was wrong. The 2 most prestigious poetry posts in the land were, at that time, occupied by locals. Roy Fuller was just completing his stint as Oxford Professor of Poetry. He lived in Langton Way, and Cecil Day Lewis, the poet laureate, was in Crooms Hill. And the area boasted many poets from earlier times, to name just three. Robert Browning, who for 4 years, immediately before eloping to Italy with Elizabeth Barrett, lived in New Cross. Walter de la Mare, born in Marion Road, later lived in Brookbank Road, Lewisham. And Ernest Dowson, the doyen of late 19th century aestheticism, who lived in Lee and is buried in Ladywell Cemetery. All that history was there. But even when we moved to our next address, Mycenae Road, close to the Royal Standard, and I began to explore the area, I continued under the misapprehension that I was living in a cultural desert. One notable for what the Italian novelist Italo Svevo called an absence of any and every kind of literature. Svevo, a protege of James Joyce and the author of the novel Confessions of Zeno, is surely one of the area's most unlikely literary inhabitants, and probably the one major 20th century novelist to have been a supporter of Charlton Athletic. He'd come here to set up a factory in Anchor and Hope Lane for his father-in-law's paint company, and he found the English winters cold. The sun here is about half the size of ours. He wrote to his wife, Livia. It has the appearance of someone with skin disease. It has lost the knack of emitting rays and has gone red with shame. He enjoyed the 10 years he spent here, nevertheless, became firm friends with the Charlton postmistress, a Miss Streeter, as well as visiting the local cinema and seeing the Lena Ashwell Players perform in Greenwich Town Hall. Even the lack of literature was a comfort to him. That of the 500,000 other inhabitants of my district, not one was nursing dreams of literary fame, gave me back my peace of mind, he said. I know the feeling. When you're a writer, you like to kid yourself you're the only one in the village. What's more, you like to think you're the first writer to discover the place. From Mycenae Road, now married to my girlfriend Kathy, I moved into a flat in Macartney House, a place primarily famous for its associations with General Wolfe, whose father owned it and whose body was shipped back there to lie in state after his death at the Battle of Quebec, before his burial at St. Alphage's. Wolfe's death inspired a jingoistic elegy from Oliver Goldsmith, as well as a painting by the American artist Benjamin West, a copy of which hangs in the hallway at Macartney House, or did when we lived there. But to me, the fascination of the place, and perhaps the reason for rashly buying the flat, when Prudence suggested that a flat on a 30-year lease was not a good investment, was that it belonged to the poet John Pudney. It was sold to us by his widow Monica. Pudney had an interesting life. He, both as a journalist and a would-be politician, he stood as a Labour candidate for Sevenoaks, no chance. He also wrote a book about the docks and a memoir of his long battle with alcoholism. Most famously, because it's arguably one of the best-known poems of the Second World War, he wrote an elegy for RAF pilots. Do not despair for Johnny head in air. He lives as sound as Johnny underground. Head in the air was a sensation I often experienced in that Macartney House flat, which had a roof terrace overlooking the park, high above ground level with the treetops. It was a euphoria not unlike Don Juan's on Shooter's Hill, undiminished by highwaymen, although our car parked outside was broken into a few times. Once when I'd stupidly left a cardboard box on the back seat, which was enticing. Obviously, the thieves must have thought they'd get something valuable like a video recorder, instead of which all was in there was 20 paperback copies of the Penguin book of contemporary British poetry. A disappointing bit of looting. After 11 years in that flat, we moved to a house on the Cater estate. I missed the park, I missed the views of the rivers, but it can't be said in literary terms I suffered a loss. Along the road, number 113, Blackheath Park, is where John Stuart Mill lived after marrying the widow Harriet Taylor in 1851. With them was Taylor's 19-year-old daughter, and it was from there for the next 20 years that Mill did his most important work on liberty and women's emancipation. A contemporary described the house as, quote, a square, plain brick mansion in a little plot of ground, but with a characteristically English air and look in its seclusion behind a wall and trim, thick shrubbery. Oddly enough, the American novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of The Scarlet Letter and House of the Seven Gables, used rather similar terms when describing the house where he lived, just round the corner in 4 Pond Road, during his spell as the US consul in England. The houses, he wrote, stand aloof from the street and separated each from its neighbour by hedge or fence in accordance with the careful exclusiveness of the English character, which impels the occupant, moreover, to cover the front of his dwelling with as much concealment of shrubbery as his limits will allow. To Hawthorne, the Cater estate was, quote, one of those oases that have grown up on the wide waste of Blackheath in singular proximity to the metropolis. The effect was wonderfully sylvan and rural, insomuch that we might have fancied ourselves in the depths of a wooded seclusion, only that at brief intervals we could hear the galloping sweep of a railway train passing within 1/4 of a mile and its discordant screech as it reached Blackheath station. It's still very much the same today. Hawthorne liked it there, but his memories of the local population were not all positive. The common people of England, he wrote, I am afraid, have no daily familiarity with even so necessary a thing as a washbowl. The women didn't impress him either. The soil and climate of England produce feminine beauty as rarely as they do delicate fruit.